So let's take a closer look at that jian, that sword. In dance and theater, the metal is solid, the sword is unbending, and again, in modern wushu and tai chi, the jian blade is thinner and it has a high degree of flexibility towards the tip. And for that purpose, it gives an auditory and a visual appeal in the performance, and kind of makes the movement more dramatic. You saw when the wushu performers like thrust the sword forward, and it wavered, and it made that very shimmering sound. The base of the blade in a sword has a guard on it. So it looks like this. And this guard at the bottom protects the hand from an opposing blade. The handle is generally just long enough for you to grip it with one hand and maybe have 2 or 3 fingers that can be held right above your hand. Now, some handles are longer. I think in the excerpt from the film, you saw that at one point, one of the artists, Michelle Yeoh, pulls out a sword that's a jian, but it's much longer, and it's held with 2 hands. That's called a shuangshou jian, and that's meant to be handled with both hands, but those are not as common as these swords. At the end of the sword handle is this thing. It's called a pommel, and the pommel is used for balance, but it also prevents the sword from slipping through your hands if you loosen your grip. And sometimes this pommel is actually used the way it sounds, to pummel somebody. So the opportunity presents itself, you could just hit your opponent with this pommel. Now, some swords have tassels attached to it. This has a very small tassel attached to it. You saw that Mr. Yulin Fang had a sword that had a much longer tassel attached to it. Historically, the tassels were used in a couple of ways. Sometimes they were wrapped around the hand or the wrist before you gripped the sword, and that was a form of protection in case your hand got hit. Also, if the sword would get knocked out of your hands with that tassel wrapped around it, you wouldn't lose your sword, you could quickly retrieve it. The other way the tassel is used is it's manipulated, like you just saw in the Peking Opera excerpt, and that is to distract your opponents. But also, in some cases, strips of metal or metal wire or thin silk cords were also intertwined with the tassel. And that could really cause injury. If you would wipe it across an opponent's face or whip it across an opponent's face, it could cause injury to their eyes. It can cause bleeding. But today, the tassel is mainly decorative, okay? Nothing embedded in this. The shape of the sword is generally wider at the base. Okay, this is my stealth sword. Okay, it's generally wider at the base and then slimmer at the tip. And usually you think of the blade in 3 sections. You think of the tip for offensive motions like stabbing, slashing, or very quick percussive cuts. The middle section of the blade is for both offensive and defensive use. With a sharp blade, that the middle of it can cause deep cleaving cuts or slicing cuts, but it's also good for defending, for blocking an opponent's sword. And finally, the part of the blade that's closest to the handle is mainly used for defensive blocking moves, and that's why it has to be thicker. I'm going to ask Tiffany Chan to come out on stage now. Tiffany is our dancer today, or one of our dancers, and Tiffany is going to demonstrate some of these jian movements as they're executed in Chinese dance. Now, although there's a lot of posturing and dramatic flourish in the dance moves, you can really see the origins of the basic fighting moves. So Tiffany's going to do a few sequences of movements. The first sequence is attack moves, which are slicing or thrusting or stabbing moves. very stylized, and it's made very beautiful for the stage. The next series of movements is defensive movements, and we're going to separate that into two sections. The first section is blocking moves. Generally, blocking moves are when you hold your sword perpendicular to an opponent's sword, so that you can deflect it, and they can't hit you with their sword. And the last series of movements is actually more of the deflecting moves, which you saw at the end of that sequence. So when you swirl the swords around your body, the opponent's sword will bounce off you, and it can ricochet in another direction, so that the opponent doesn't have a chance to hit you with their sword. In martial arts, Chinese opera and dance, the greater emphasis is on the external display of movement. In Qigong and Tai Chi, it's different in that the focus is more internal. Does anyone here do Tai Chi or Qigong in the audience? Okay, some people do. Great. Fantastic. In Qigong, the practice cultivates and channels your internal energy, otherwise known as your qi. And the purpose is mainly to improve physical and mental health. So Tai Chi sword is more than just a sequence of movements. It's an art form of visualizing the movement of the energy, the qi, through different parts of your body, and then extend it through to the very tip and end of your sword. In order for to master the art form, it requires a different understanding of the sword's structure and its application and the behavior. The movements are calm, they're very controlled, they're relaxed, very deliberate and balanced. Unlike other forms of sword, the Tai Chi sword has a discernible inward focus that bridges sword techniques and a wholeness of mind and spirit. This is partly why the Tai Chi sword is said to be favored by scholars. Confucius was often portrayed with a Tai Chi sword hanging at his side. So look closely when you see, an image of Confucius next.